All right, so Keeper 1.1, we're talking about analyzing categorical data. Now, if you remember, in Keeper 1.0, we discussed the differences between the two variables. So we had categorical variables and we also had quantitative variables. And so our categorical variables were the variables that take items and put them into different groups or different categories. And so the values of the categorical variables are the labels for each of the different categories. So I have a little example here. Format, the format is the variable, but then you have the actual values of that, which is like adult contemporary, adult standards, country, any of those things. So those are the actual values of that variable. Another example would be like my variable could be ethnicity, and then the values would be African American, Caucasian, Asian. Those would be the actual values. Now, once you identified your values, you can either look at the distribution in terms of counts or percents. So in this first table, we're looking at it in terms of counts. And in the second table, we look at it in terms of percents. Now, the major difference between these two tables, again, they're telling you the same thing, but the first table is what we call a frequency table. And the second one, so this table right here is our frequency table, and this next one is our relative frequency table. And so again, a frequency table goes over your counts versus your relative frequency table uses percents. All right, so again, it's all good to look at these tables, but it's sometimes kind of hard to read. The numbers don't just tell you automatically what you're seeing or what it's supposed to show you. So a lot of times we, instead of looking at the tables, we create graphs to help us better understand or display the data. So we have bar graphs, which is shown here, or we can do a pie chart, which is shown to the right. Bar graphs usually used for counts, although you can use percents as well. But your pie chart, you generally only see with percents. Now, truth be told, we rarely use pie charts because they're hard to draw. They're hard to accurately get a good drawing for those. All right, now, again, bar graphs compare several quantities, and you're using heights of bars to actually show what each value represents. Just make sure that when you're using bar graphs that you make the area of the bars or the width of the bars the same. A lot of times it is very deceiving when you're looking at a bar graphs and the widths of the bars are different. Makes it feel like one bar is actually bigger than the other when it's not. Lastly, you want to try to avoid temptation when using pictographs, like pictures instead of bars. A lot of times they can be misleading because, again, the actual shape and the width of the bar tells you whether or not, or it makes you believe that there's more than there actually is. All right, next, if we're analyzing two categorical variables, we often use a two-way table. A two-way table, again, takes like two variables, like maybe gender and then happiness rating or something like that. You're taking two categorical variables and you're analyzing it into a two-way table. You guys have seen two-way tables in the past. In a two-way table, you'll have several rows and several columns, almost like a matrix, to analyze the data. Within your two-way tables, we have something called marginal distributions. The marginal distributions are the totals of your columns and rows. Usually with marginal distributions, you want to get them in percents. So you take the total and you divide it out by the grand total of the entire table. Now, if you want to examine your marginal distribution, again, you calculate all your totals, you divide them out by the grand total, and then typically you'll make a graph to show what those marginal distributions look like. All right, the only issue with marginal distributions is that it tells you nothing about the relationship between the variables. It just tells you about the overall total or the grand total. So if you want to find out information about the variables and how they interact with each other, we use what's called a conditional distribution. Now, when you're making a conditional distribution or you're trying to analyze your conditional distribution, you want to select your rows or your columns that you're interested in, and then you want to use the data to calculate the actual distribution in percents. Once you do that, typically you'll do a side-by-side bar graph or a segmented bar graph to analyze that data. All right, lastly, from now until the end of the year, We have kind of like a 4-step process for analyzing statistical problems. Your first step is you're going to state. So you're going to state what you're trying to answer or what you're trying to find. You're going to plan out how to do it. Then you're going to do whatever it takes, whatever calculations or graphs or whatever you need to do. And lastly, you always conclude. Never end a problem without concluding. All right, that's it.